My name is Helen Reese, and I'm the president of the Fort Hall Forum, so I get the privileged position of sort of telling you how the evening will run and telling you the things you can do and can't do. It won't take long. First of all, thank you all for coming. This is the last forum of our fall season, and it couldn't be a better topic to talk about. I think everybody knows more about business and how it works and how it doesn't work and how it affects us than probably ever in the history of business. And we are thrilled to have with us tonight a wonderful man who's the 10th dean of the Harvard Business School, and a very ethical man, I have to tell you. I know that for a fact. And a great teacher and a great administrator. And to have Tom Peters, who is one of the great business writers of our times, and not only can take complicated things and make it accessible, but he's the most lovable man, probably, in his field. Isn't that true? Donna will all attest to that. So they will get on with this in a couple of minutes. I have to tell you a couple of things. First of all, this event is being recorded, and it will be available free for you on YouTube and iTunes. And if you subscribe to your YouTube channel, we will post this in a couple of weeks. And when you come up to ask questions at the end, please speak directly into the microphone, and know that both the audience and the video camera will pick it up. And please understand that by speaking, you are giving the Fort Hall Forum permission to record you. And right now, unless you're live blogging, please turn your cell phones off. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, of which we have many. First and foremost, the Forum, who provides us with space and is supportive of everything we do and provides us with this facility, and could not be a better institution to be allied with. We also thank the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council and Barr Foundation, the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, and we encourage you to go to a restaurant that sponsors us at the, it's called the Woodward at the Ames Hotel after the forum. Finally, we have brochures that we don't let anybody leave the end of the evening unless you take one, because we want you all to be very supportive of our forum. We are turning 109 years old next year, and we are the oldest free lecture bureau in the country, and we take great pride in that because of the obvious competition that we have in a million and more ways. So we need your support. We need you to come here like you're coming tonight. We need you to take those brochures, become a member, be generous, help us go into our next 100 years by supporting us. And now, I am just about done. I'm going to turn this over to one of the most extraordinary women I have known over the years, Donna Carpenter, who is sitting to my left. Donna began her career as a writer, as a newspaper writer, and she worked for business, for the New York Times. She worked for Inc. magazine, and for several newspapers. She won prestigious awards for her reporting, her investigating, her writing, and her investigative capabilities. She did that as a very young woman, and then worked as a writer and a collaborator on many books over a period of 20 years, most of them business books, and most of them very important as she collaborated on them. A few of the titles, if I went through all of them, I would be here much longer than you want me to be. But to mention a few: Re-engineering the Corporation, Discipline of Market Leaders, Re-engineering Management, The Machine That Changed the World, and Bankruptcy 1995. Those are just a few that were bestsellers. Donna recently, within the last half a dozen years, being 10 steps ahead of everybody else, got into digital publishing, formed her own company, and is the CEO and works diligently at New Word City. It's a leader in digital publishing. It specializes, it was her concept, to do nonfiction books in business, history, various subjects, pioneering ebooks in short forms so that people they're not only accessible and informative, but they're not 2,000 pages with a lot of detail. And they are wonderful. She's only been doing this for less than 6 years, and over 7 million copies have already been sold. So Donna is one of the great women in our industry, and I am delighted that she's with us tonight. I learned yesterday that she was taking the night flight back from Europe so that she could be with us tonight. So I'm turning it over to Donna and want to personally thank you for making the effort to get here. And I'm going to be part of the audience and enjoy listening to the three of you with everybody else.
Thank you.
Thank you all for making the effort to do this. Thank you.
One of the things, I was not expecting the introduction from Helen, one of the things that I've learned in life as a writer is it's not about me, it's about them. So Tom, as you know, is one of the leading business thinkers really on the planet. I mean, he's wrote a book many, many years ago called In Search of Excellence, and he's written many, many books since then. And I think the 7 million figure that Helen just quoted related to me is kind of paltry compared to what Tom has sold. It's rather an extraordinary journey, and he never fails to inspire and provoke. Nitin is the dean of the Harvard Business School, as Helen mentioned. He is one of the more radical people I know. You'd never think that upon meeting him, but he is extraordinarily creative and doing work at the business school that I think all of us are just delighted to see happen. The topic tonight is ethics, and ethics covers right and wrong, and there's plenty of both in business, as we all know. But today I want to engage Tom and Nitin in a broader discussion, which is the moral purpose of business. I've known, admired, and worked with them both for years. Together they make for a potent mixture that's bound to change the way we think about business and why we're in it. But we have to, as they say, get on with it. So I'd like to start with a quote from Richard Branson, which I picked up from my friend Tom, which is, "Business has to give people enriching, rewarding lives, or it's simply not worth doing." So the topic here isn't so much what we're in business for, but why we're in business. And Nitin, I'd like to start with you. The MBA oath, which you drafted, is trending and even has its own Wikipedia page, which I'm sure you are familiar with. Could you tell us about it and why it matters, and also how it will affect the next generation of business leaders?
So the origins of the oath were quite straightforward. I have a sister. She's a doctor. And it was always interesting to me that being a doctor, she had no doubt that she was doing something that was virtuous and moral and good for society and good for people. And somehow, as someone who was interested in business, I didn't enjoy the same benefit. There was a sense in which people used to always question whether being a business person was inherently good or not. And in my own heart, I never felt that I was doing anything that was less virtuous than what my sister did. I always felt that business is one of these amazing social inventions that creates prosperity for so many. That was noble work. It was morally important work. It was work that anybody who does should feel proud of. So I said, what's the difference? Like, why is it that here's this one field in which people inherently assume that the work that the people do is moral, and there's another field that for some reason there's doubts about? And I wondered whether it was because everybody in business somehow seems to understand that whether it's the Hippocratic Oath or through a concept like that, what can be expected of a doctor? You start off with the conviction that at least these are people who swear to say we will do no harm. And in business, nobody's sure that business people necessarily believe that. So the question was, could we maybe what we needed was something that would have that same kind of moral orientation, a framework that would allow us to say, these are our commitments in terms of what we as business leaders believe we can do. And if we could agree to that, perhaps we could create confidence both among ourselves and other people, that just as you can trust doctors to create health, business leaders are committed to creating value and prosperity for society. And when they don't, they're not living up to what it means to be a business leader. And they should be embarrassed, just as a doctor who causes harm should feel embarrassed. And if we could get both business people and society to understand that the expectation that you should have of business leaders can be grounded in something that is akin to the Hippocratic Oath, maybe we'd make progress in both allowing business people to have a clearer sense of what their obligations are, but also society to say, what can you hold us accountable for? Because this is something that we believe in.
Is there any sense of the adoption rate of the oath among students or people already in business?
So a lot of people ask me that question, and I've never thought that success lies in whether people adopt the oath. My real goal was to ask people to say, if you don't take this oath, what do you believe in?
Right.
Like, tell me what you find objectionable in this oath, and if there's something that's objectionable, let's have a conversation about that. Because if you don't have these beliefs, at least let's get clear about what it is that you do believe in. Because I think that what's murky today is that people don't know what to expect of business leaders. And this was just a way to provoke people into saying, can we get clearer? And to provoke you to get clearer, I'm going to actually try and write it out.
Right, exactly. Tom, do you think business has a moral duty to employees, to shareholders, to any group of constituents, or even to itself?
Without any question whatsoever. The fact that you have to ask the question is troublesome, which I think is the same thing that you're doing. When you were saying that, Nitin, it reminded me in my MBA, which was not here on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, was now, 72, it's my 40th reunion. And one might argue that times have changed or not, but as I listened to you, I bordered on weeping. That conversation was never held. The individual professors with whom I worked were people who I, in most cases, admired to a significant degree, but nobody ever bothered to say, why are we here? What's the point? I mean, my problem, Donna, and Nitin expressed it far better than I, is, to me, there was a book written about, when was servant leadership written? Do you remember? 40 years ago, 30 years ago?
In the 70s.
The book came out, Robert Greenleaf is the guy who wrote it, and I remember picking it up and saying, this is cool, and tossing it away. And in fact, I only read it about 2 years ago and was furious at myself that I hadn't read it before. But the notion in my mind, and I think it's very consistent with what you said, is any organization, profit, nonprofit, or what have you, exists to be of service. And I ran around the world for a long time and was able to put more than a couple of pennies in my pocket by screaming the customer comes first. And in the last 5 years have been screaming the customer comes second, because for the customer to come first, the person who serves the customer must come more first. But there's a Boston corporation that most of you know, the Cabot Corporation, a chemical company, middle-sized chemical company, and the guy who runs it is a friend of mine. And he invited me to come to Zurich to talk to his top 140 officers a couple of years ago. And I was flying over on the plane. It was about 2 weeks from my 68th birthday. And I thought, who am I talking to? And I thought, well, it's going to be 150 people, and they've probably reached their most senior, statistically position that they're going to reach. They're in charge of something, which is non-trivial. And so I wrote this little thing on the way over that I called The Memories That Matter. Mm-hmm. And what are you going to look back on? And I suspect as a professor, as a dean, and I think it should be true with everybody, nobody has their net worth on their tombstone. It's who are the people who you influence, whose growth? My mother taught the 5th grade for 25 years to put me through school initially. And the highlight of my life at her memorial service, she taught the 5th grade, 10-year-olds. She died in 1995, was the 50-year-olds who attended that memorial service and the degree to which they felt she had influenced their lives. Probably many teachers in this room, and you understand that well, but that's what any of us ought to be. Business, non-business, what have you. And so moral purpose to me is a given. I have no comprehension of why the hell you would bother to get out of bed in the morning if that was not your purpose. And I must say, I you know, as part of this conversation tonight, I'm just here as a fan of Nitin's.
Look who's talking, right? I mean, this is the guy who drew me into business
Yeah.
to begin with. I had the great privilege of meeting Tom recently, and I had never met him. And I came to study at the Sloan School in 1984 and became fascinated with this idea of what makes companies better or worse performers. And it was all because of your first book. So we're a kind of mutual fan club here, so you'll have to be careful about if you expect controversy from us, it's going to be hard to generate it right now, but Donna's going to try.
Just one small thing I must say, which I really should not say in a public setting, which is what I've been doing all my life.
Right.
I wrote my book 30 years ago and became a significant critic of business schools to the point that I was invited back to my own school. I don't remember where it is. I remember where it is. I don't remember what school is. It's a place in Palo Alto. And when I came back to give a distinguished lecture, the dean refused to introduce me because of the critical nature. Now, I didn't see, just to make it clear, when was the next time I saw that dean? And the answer was on CNN, testifying before Congress as to how he, who was one of the dozen leading accountants on earth, had served as chairman of the audit committee at Enron and not seen a damn thing. So I figure I won that round. But, you know, anyway.
But how do you, I mean, you talk about Enron. I mean, where does that start?
I'd rather not. But
Well, I know. But where does that start, and how does it permeate an entire organization?
It didn't start when I was a McKinsey consultant managing Jeff Skilling.
Right.
I was his first boss, and he once said, everything I learned about management, I learned from you.
Oh, good. We will not put that on your
We'll not put that on, I've not got that on my transcript.
So I have often wondered, where do these things start? Because it's very tempting when people fail to conclude that, you know, somewhere deep down, if we just could trace far enough into their history, we would find the dark seed that was always waiting to be discovered that made a person corrupt. That if we'd known Jeff Skilling as a young boy, or if we'd known him as a young adult, we would have found that trace of evil that was lurking underneath. I think that's a very wrong way of thinking about ethics. I actually think that we should each have the humility to know that we all have in us the possibility of being both great and of being quite terrible. And we see that all the time. I mean, the best evidence of that is, you know, after World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, there was this great scientist at Yale, who many of you might know, Stanley Milgram, who conducted these Milgram studies. He just couldn't believe that, you know, there could be, the whole German nation could be evil. But how could you conclude that a whole nation could be evil? So he said, you know, are there circumstances in which people will blindly obey authority and do things that would be against their own moral conscience? So he created this experiment in which random people were called out of the street, and they were put in a setting where they had to give electric shocks to someone who was put in the position. They were a teacher and the other one was a learner, and if the learner made mistakes, you were supposed to give them shocks as a way to reinforce and help them do better. And at the mere instructions of a lab court instructor who just kept saying, do it, 80% of the people gave electric shocks that went to the level of XXXXX. Right? So Now, these are good people. These are not people who had, who were disturbed or who you said were evil or corrupt. These were good people who found themselves in a circumstance where they ended up doing terrible things. And they felt regretful after the fact. They were so relieved when they were told that the person who was on the other side hadn't in fact suffered. But yet they had lost their own moral conscience for a while. So I think that the danger that we have with people who are business leaders, and Jeff Skilling is an example, is that you hear so much that you're extraordinary, and he had become a celebrated darling, and we at Harvard Business School were part of celebrating him. We wrote several cases that lionized some of the innovations that he had. And then he got himself caught, I think, in a place where this great strategy that he had, that everything could be converted into a market, was beginning to run out of steam. And I sometimes wonder whether he went beyond the boundary because he just felt the pressure to prove to people that he was as smart as everybody thought he was. And that desire to be just seen as smart is what led him astray, as opposed to, this was an evil person where bad things were just waiting to happen. I worry a lot about a way of thinking about ethics that brands people as inherently good or inherently bad. That's not to say that there aren't some people who are malevolent and have been for a long time, and that there's some people who are saints and are like that for a long time. But I think that the vast majority of us are quite capable of both good and bad behavior, and we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we stay true to our own moral convictions? Because just knowing that you're moral doesn't mean that you will necessarily behave that way. And I think that that's a place where the conversation about ethics and morality gets more interesting, as opposed to a clear sense of, here's where I draw the line, and if you go, most people know that. I mean, there's not a single student that we graduate from Harvard Business School who doesn't know that it's bad to lie, cheat, or steal.
Right.
Yet someone will at some point in life. And the more interesting question to ask is why? Why do people who know that that's a bad thing to do still end up acting that way?
Well, we had this conversation, we're talking a little bit a couple of days ago about this, and I said to Donna and Nitin that the single question, which by definition is unanswerable, that I ask myself over and over and over again. I was born in 1942, so I was a birth in World War II, is if I had been in France in June of 1940, would I have been a collaborator or a resistant? And obviously, I'd love to think it would be the latter, and yet I have utterly no reason to believe I would have been. It's just which I think is your point. Incidentally, as you well know, the Milgram experiment then, and I almost think in its own fashion worse, was repeated by Phil Zimbardo at Stanford as the Stanford prison experiment. And random human beings were grabbed off the streets of Palo Alto, which is not precisely an ordinary town, and randomly assigned as prison guards and prisoners. It was a 2-week experiment to look at behavior. They stopped it after 3 days because the randomly assigned guards were beating the prisoners, and the prisoners were behaving in ways which were truly tragic, and they had to stop it. And again, if we had them, it's a horrid conundrum for all of us.
I think that what makes it even harder, Tom, is that at least you have the humility to genuinely question which side of this you would have been on. So, we show the Milgram experiments to our students, and we tell them, 80% of the people randomly chosen would go to XXX. So we ask them, how many of you think that you would have gone to XXX? What fraction do you think is willing to admit that I'm one of the people who would have been in that 80%?
0.
Literally 0, right? So they all have this massive moral overconfidence that says, I'm going to be the good person. I sometimes wonder whether it's that moral overconfidence that gets us.
Right.
Right? It's like, because if you feel so sure about yourself, morally, you almost say, I could never do anything wrong. And you can rationalize anything that you do by saying, that's just expedient. I'm not doing anything morally wrong. Because you have this false sense of self-confidence that you're going to be the person who's going to be on the right side of the ledger. And that's very troublesome. I often think that the place where you slip first, which then leads to what you later on describe as the horrors of a person like Jeff Skilling, comes from an initial step of moral overconfidence that gets you in the wrong place.
One of the questions, too, is really about sort of the global nature of ethics. And there's a person in the audience here who's a graduate of your business school, Nitin, who once said to me that ethics is a luxury of the successful in a civil society. I'm in Nigeria. I'm in the oil business. What am I going to do?
It's a very hard question. I mean, it's a hard question because history teaches us that even in America, at an earlier stage of our own economic development, there was plenty of corruption. Right? So if you think about the early days of when we had the trusts in the United States in the 1910s, or certainly between 1860 and 1900, in the early stage of American economic development, there was plenty of corruption, corruption of the kind that we see in emerging markets today. In fact, I had someone recently tell me that maybe that's the definition of an emerging market. Just as other institutions are evolving in an emerging market, the institutions of morality are emerging too. And maybe that's a definition of what makes it an emerging market, that these things aren't well established. But I find it troublesome to go from there to say, and therefore it's okay. Because in every one of these emerging markets, you can find examples of companies that choose to take a different path and prosper. Right? So in India, for example, which is a country where today I grew up there, the scourge of corruption is almost destroying the nation as we speak today. But there's a company called for the longest time, we grew up, and when I grew up, there was a company called the Tata Group, and it was associated with being a company of integrity. And it's because it was a company that was associated with integrity, people would buy its products and have greater confidence in it, and they found it easier to raise capital. So in fact, in the cesspool, you can stake out a position of honor, which almost gives you more advantage. And you could see the advantage that it was the only brand name that people trusted. So they could put their brand on anything. It became this mega large conglomerate that could get into any business. And usually we say, conglomerates have very little added value because you should just break it up and let each of these companies be individual companies. But Tata derived value as a conglomerate because of this brand of integrity. And I have been in every market that you can think of that's an emerging market. In any industry, you at least find one player who doesn't succumb to the pressure of saying just because we're an emerging market, we should be corrupt. So if that's possible, then why should we accept this general argument? Right? I find that hard.
Can you do something else for me? Because your breadth of experience is so much greater than mine in that regard. If you could put the right calipers on it, my assumption would be that at the level of people in small communities, there's virtually no difference. The acts of thoughtfulness and moral behavior I got into a bit of a spat with my wife. It was actually the first time it had ever happened. When Vermonters reacted quite well to Irene a year ago, which we did, we had that moral certainty in Vermont. And we said, we're Vermonters. We even have license plates that say how fabulous we are. And I said then, and I suspect the last 36 hours have been an illustration of this, I said, whoa. I remember the blackout in New York City. And in my opinion, probably the share of moral behavior in New York City, and I suspect it's the case in the last 36 hours, is no different than what you find in Teignmouth, Vermont, where I now happen to live. And so, presumably there are differences between the institutional infrastructure, But at the level of the individual human being, I at least would be exceedingly surprised if there was much difference. I mean, I do find that in my travels.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think that, as a baseline, people are, on average, more trustworthy than not. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who you should be careful of extending your trusts to. But you see trustworthy behavior everywhere in the world. So there's no reason to be cynical about
And
the
probably
possibility.
probably the same share.
Yeah, and the same share. I think it's, so rural parts of India, I think, are as trustworthy as rural parts of America. In a large city, you better be a little bit more careful on average, and that's true in large cities in India too. But I do think that the role of government and the fact that goods are scarce and the license to operate is granted by governments, in many cases, I think that that's where corruption creeps in. Because if entry into any field is limited, and by getting into a field you can make a lot of money, the person who controls that entry is going to extract some rent out of it, and very often that's what governments do in many of these emerging markets. And business leaders at that point have a choice. Do I pay that rent or do I not? And it's too tempting to not pay the rent, and that's very often how corruption begins. And once it becomes established, then it becomes rampant, and it takes some courage to stand against it. But as I said, what's striking to me is that people who show the capacity to have that courage and say, I'm going to stand apart, I'm not going to succumb to this, succeed. I had a wonderful leader called Azim Premji, who runs a company called Wipro, which was it's an IT company and has this record of not having paid a bribe or any one of these things. I once asked him, how did you get away with that? And he says, even the people who take bribes in the end know how to be efficient. Right? So if they know that you're not going to give one, then they at some point realize that there's no point in wasting my time with this guy. Might as well just give him his license and move on, because the other person who's standing there is the one whom I'm going to get my bribe from. And they just have to know that you won't succumb, because in the end, then they say, I'm going to allocate my effort efficiently as well.
It reminds me of Edward Banfield, I think, at Harvard, who did a study on how do you predict which homes will be broken into. And the answer was the ones where the people didn't lock their doors. and again, if you're being an efficient criminal, statistically speaking, if you're surveying a 2-block area, presumably either through laziness, sloppiness, or what have you, there will be 1.7 homes that are unlocked, and that works pretty well if you move fast, presumably.
Exactly. That's funny. But both of you are students of organizations, and let's sort of bring it back to that arena. I'm working on the BP Horizon oil platform, and I'm a crane operator, and I know what's wrong. How do you, as an organization, encourage people to come forward to say there's something rotten here that has to be fixed, rather than suppressing that kind of information?
So I helped develop a course at Harvard Business School called Leadership and Corporate Accountability with a lot of my colleagues. And what was striking to us is that we couldn't find a single case in which there was something very serious that happened at the end, in which someone hadn't raised their hand to say there's a problem.
So they raised their hand, but nobody was listening.
In every case, so whether it was Enron, you find an example like that, whether it was Sears and the problems that they had in the with the Sears Automotive Center. So we probably have written 100 cases of examples where something went very badly wrong at the end. And in every case, there's an example of someone who tried to raise their hand and say, hello, this isn't quite the way it should be. And for whatever sort of reasons, they got ignored. People describe them as troublemakers or this, that, and the other. And we've now tried to, the US government acting on this insight has created these whistleblower laws where you can be protected, you get all these rewards for being a whistleblower. We've tried to create these hotlines where people can call in and report. So almost every company has put in place opportunities to make it, quote unquote, safer for people to speak up. Yet I think these are Band-Aids in my view. The fundamental experience that most employees have is it's very hard to speak truth to power. And all of us who find ourselves in the position where you end up being powerful have to stay open to recognizing that you really, really have to work hard to allow someone to speak truth to you. You should not just expect that that's going to happen. And creating that culture where people know that it's okay, where they can bring issues to you. People pick up the signals very quickly. Like, when you say that to them, you say, oh, where did you learn that from? I'm sorry, I told you, they never come back to you, right? So I think it's a lot more about the culture you create than the mechanisms that you, formal mechanisms that you produce.
Well, I'd argue it's both.
Yeah.
In strong measure. I've had the privilege of spending a little bit of time, I'm sure all of you know, mostly through Dr. Gwandi, but the inventor of the fabled checklist was a guy by the name of Peter Pronovost at Johns Hopkins. And the story is, as many of you know, is quite simple. Cause people to follow a checklist and you will reduce the errors dramatically in an ICU initially. The problem was, which Nitin would have predicted from what he just said, is it didn't work because among other things there was a culture that said nurses couldn't tell doctors who had not washed their hands to wash their hands. And as a result, I mean, and it's interesting, and thinking about the Harvard Business School and so on, there's a wonderful quote from Peter in his book that I love, and it said, and I think you could definitely say it about business school. I'm an engineer by initial training. You could say it there as well. He said, I must have spent 500 hours as a student looking through a microscope, something that I have never done since I left school, and I did not have 1 minute's training in team leadership. And it doesn't surprise me in the least, but the system is critical. The checklist is critical. Another example, I'm doing a lot of work in healthcare, and with all due regard to your sister, the level of integrity is not what one would hope, I'm afraid. But there was a lovely book written, and I've forgotten the whole title, but it was Why the VA's Healthcare is Better Than Yours, fundamentally. And with, there were dirty closets at Walter Reed in Washington, but statistically, every time quality measures come up, the VA tends to top the list, but very specifically. And A, time is short, and B, I don't know the details of the story, but there is an ethos against reporting errors in the healthcare system. And somehow or other, through attitude, through system, and so on, in a relatively short period of time, the entire VA system increased the number of errors reported by a factor of 30. But it was a deep cultural deal because it's all these grays again that you're talking about. This was not to say that doctors who had committed egregious sin would not be called for it, but in general, the reporting of an error was made into a positive thing instead of a negative thing. But it can work. It can work systemically. The success record. Pronovost started his thing at Johns Hopkins, and Johns Hopkins, like Harvard, and et cetera, is not run of the mind. He repeated it in inner city hospitals, initially starting in Detroit. But it's a monumental challenge. And don't get me started on healthcare. But there's no data. There's fundamentally no data in an area where no data about errors in an area where one would assume that was the most treasured of all outcomes.
It's striking that there's a colleague of mine, Amy Edmondson, who did this study at Harvard, at the Harvard hospitals, where she found this very counterintuitive result, that the more there was errors that were reported in a unit, the better were their overall health outcomes over time. That might seem like an odd thing to discover, that why would you expect that a unit that reports more errors would have better health outcomes? And then she discovered that exactly what you said, that the units actually that had the courage to report errors, there was enough psychological safety that they were willing to report errors, were more likely to then fix them. Whereas there were all kinds of other units, it's not like there weren't errors occurring, they just weren't reporting them.
Right.
And that whole culture of not, in fact, having the candor, as you were saying, to speak up when there are issues that are occurring, is what was causing those units to both underreport errors, but then never learn from their errors and therefore have bad medical outcomes over time. So she came up with this construct called psychological safety, which she thinks is absolutely essential to create if you want to have a prayer of having people speak up and prevent medical errors, but also moral errors from occurring in organizations. But I think that that's one of the hardest problems for leaders to address. How do you create a culture in which people will speak up?
I think one of the best management books in a long time that's been written is the one that was written about the Mayo Clinic in that regard. And what's fascinating was, to me, was that the idea of team medicine was introduced by Dr. Mayo back in 1910. And you see these extraordinary things, among other things, and this is using a pickaxe instead of a scalpel, is Mayo brags about the number of doctors that it has warned or fired who did not play the game according to team rules. And at least in my experience, that is about as out of the ordinary as one could possibly imagine. But you know, they've been at it for 100 years now for all practical purposes, and I'm sure they've had many a lapse, as you would have to have. But it is deep-seated culturally, it's deep-seated systemically, and relative to those in power. I mean, again, I admit to be flippant in my conversation, and I know we, meaning you and I, as both of the business school cultures, are not immune from this, but to me, med schools are the most efficient institutions on earth at indirectly teaching arrogance. Well, the whole damn thing, as far as I understand it, comes from the fact that doctors were all snake oil salesmen, and then somebody invented penicillin, and suddenly doctors could save people, and it went to their head. And that's, I'm sure we have MDs here, and they're the exceptions to the rules, the one that are here this evening. But
Exactly. But you mentioned the word arrogance, which makes me think of Penn State. How do you recover from such a lapse as Penn State has had?
you saw today, they are indicting the president.
I was on a plane last night.
Yeah,
So,
that was the news of the day in Penn State.
can they recover from it? Can any organization that has such a lapse recover from it? And
Well,
not just Penn
one
State, but
small example of that.
Lehman Brothers. I mean,
Well, no, this is slightly not as extreme as Penn State, and some of you who may have better knowledge than I may disagree. Exxon recovered to a significant degree from the Valdez, and they did so in part by becoming absolutely vicious on topics of safety. And really did, I don't know what, I think they always had a culture of operational excellence, if you will, but obviously they had a hell of a problem with the Valdez, but they didn't mess around. The number of times that they have stand downs where everybody stops, examines what they're doing, and so on. And so in that case, it suggests that recovery is possible. Penn State is perhaps a horse of a different color.
Right.
Maybe it ought to be.
Exactly. Value statements are often used to try to instill moral behavior in organizations. Do they work?
There's the man who's going to tell us for certain in 5 years.
So I think that it's very hard for them to work. You can't go to a single company and not find their values on their website. You can just try it out, right? Like you can literally dial up any one of the websites of any one of the Fortune 500 or any company that you choose, and you'll find the value statements of the companies prominently displayed. Having a value statement is not the same as having values.
Right.
Right. So, you can easily fool yourself that just because we put it up and we put it in, and you can carry like pocket cards that read your values, and you can give people pens that have your values written on them. You have to, the need for an organization to live its values and have their leaders in many ways allow people to know when they are and when they're not, and being willing to make very costly decisions when the organization seems to not be abiding by its values is vital, right? I mean, the best example that we know, and it's a much admired man who just passed away, and therefore in his memory it's important to remember him, is Jim Burke of Johnson & Johnson, who famously, not once but twice, had to fight Tylenol tragedies, and in each case was able to step up to make the decision to say we're going to take this product off the market, and showed that the Johnson & Johnson credo, which was a statement of that company's values, as a result was a real thing. Now, this company today has become a poster child of the exact opposite, right? It still has its credo, but if you look at the number of times in recent years where Johnson & Johnson has found itself on the other side of it, in some ways I'm almost grateful that Jim Burke passed away, because I can't imagine a person who did so much for that company. But here's what he did beyond recalling Tylenol. Right? So after Tylenol happened, and this is what I think makes a company's value statement real. He went around the world, visited every one of the major operations of Johnson & Johnson. People thought, CEO's coming, they're going to have to do the business review, they're going to get the numbers right, they're going to make the plants look great because he's going to visit all. But he just went to every office, and what he would do is he would read the value statement that was hanging in every wall. He would take it down, and he said, are we living these values? And so he and his chief operating officer, that's the only conversation they had. Now, a CEO's time is not invaluable. It's a very, very valuable time. So when people saw that here's a guy who's gone around the world to 40 different locations, and the only conversation he wants to have is, are we living up to these values? That's when you know that this is not just some corporate PR thing, right? It's a real thing that has to happen. And that's what it takes. I think it takes a almost unnatural commitment to these words if they want to become real, because the baseline of people is to be cynical about these values, and they look for every example of whether you live up to it or not. And unless you're willing to take some costly decisions in support of your values, are you willing to fire the high-performing jerk? Right? Are you willing to lose some profit to remain customer-centric? Are you willing to walk away from a deal that's bad for your client? Right. These are the things that people notice and observe to judge whether the company is true to its values or not.
The thought that is triggered by that, and I'm not sure this is directly in line or not. I spent 4 years in the Navy. In many respects, the 4 best years of my life. And I think the military does a pretty good job on this dimension. And one thought that occurred to me that I've been just playing around with is, and I think it's directly related, why is it that in the military, the person who worries about training is a 4-star general, and in the average corporation, it's a mid-level bureaucratic job? Which is not to say that wrong values can't be. I was doing something in Korea at some Korean equivalent of Davos, and got off on a tangent about this. And I said that, speaking of moral values, that I don't certainly argue that there should not be any outsourcing, but I argued from the standpoint of the United States or Korea when I was there, that the number one commitment of an institution must be developing, as we look forward for the sake of the nation, the institution, our communities, the quality of the talent that we have within. And I argued specifically that the chief training officer should be sitting next to the chief financial officer and the chief marketing officer. But we're, you know, if you're talking cops, firemen, ballerinas, actors, actresses, privates, and corporals, life is primarily about training. Well, it's not in the corporation. I spoke to the American Society for Training and Development a few years ago, and they were bragging that we were now up in the United States to, on average, 24 hours a year in training. And, you know, when I've given 3,000 bloody speeches, and to give a 45-minute speech takes me somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 hours of prep at the age of 70, for God's sakes, and I still don't ever get them right. But it's an ethos of development, which then I would argue, relative to what you are saying, makes it far more plausible. I mean, another variation on this theme, and you know, I apologize for boring you with my hobby horses, is relative to the military. Again, when I've been talking to people lately, I've said if you lose, speaking as a former Navy lieutenant, if you lose your ensigns, lieutenants, lieutenant commanders, it's a bad day. If you lose your chief petty officers, the game is over. And sergeants in the case of the military. And again, to transform that into the world of medicine, business, or what have you, we don't pay enough attention to that first line supervisor who, you know, there's a fair amount of hard evidence, as I understand it. So the one liner I heard is people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. And I suspect there's a lot of truth to that. But if values are associated with, I mean, Jim Burke, who we wrote about in Search of Excellence and who I adored, if you have a situation like that, it's got to go through the entire organization. But Jesus, we're not serious about training in business.
We wanted to open up the floor to questions. So if anyone has a question for Lieutenant Peters or Dr. Nohria, if you please come to the microphones on each one side of the other. Yes.
Well, it seems that people are everywhere, so there's going to be corruption everywhere. Are we singling out business above every other institution as being more corrupt than these other fields, or is it about the same as the other fields? And secondly, we're encouraged to applaud the increase of women in corporate America as they move up the ladder into positions of responsibility. Is there any evidence that the presence of women in these positions will do something to create more ethical behavior? Is anybody willing to say that?
I am.
Go ahead, elaborate. The answer is yes, and.
Well, I think in terms of the hard evidence, which is quite nice in that regard, is economic performance. Economic performance improves when there's a balance of men and women at a significant level in an institution. But you started it in 1996, Donna. Donna forced me into a meeting where I assumed I was a with it guy, and I put the toilet seat down after I pee and things like that. And you brought together an extraordinary group of women who caused an epiphany, and it's a term which is a term I despise because it's used too cheaply. But I strongly believe, and going back to Darwin, that fundamentally women bring a different ethos into the workplace, and certainly have their own set of sins and behaviors that are not what they ought to be. I mean, one of the common lines today, which I think is true, a product development team at the Ford Motor Company in 1955 consisted of approximately 100% of people who worked for the Ford Motor Company. And so, you counted the stripes on their sleeves the same way you do in the United States Navy. Today, if you're on a 40-person product development team, it's going to have people from 14 different companies in 6 different industries from 3 different continents and 8 different companies. And so the ability to give orders in the way that we have done typically is gone. And there is, I believe, a great deal of evidence that says when in direction is the effective style of leadership, it is far more likely that women will exercise. I remember Bob Wright, and I stole this for a book a few years ago, when he was teaching at Brandeis. He said if he posed a question to a group of students about getting something done, the male would typically respond yes or no, but he would say, no, I can't do it because I have to go through him and he outranks me. He would ask the same question to women, and they would fundamentally say, no problem, we'll do a workaround. You know, X will go to Y, who will go to Z, and we will have it. You know, I don't like simplistic responses to that question, but I strongly believe that the presence of women in far greater numbers than we have to do today in the workplace will make my hypothesis is that it will make an enormous difference.
A question from a woman is appropriate.
Thank you. Apple and Foxconn have been in the news for this year and back and forth with tragedies in China with working conditions, and Apple makes moves towards supplier code of ethics and responsibility. But do you see a company like Apple really stepping back from Foxconn, given the scale that Foxconn can produce on at the cost that they produce, and the fact that all the competition to Apple also uses Foxconn? I'm interested to hear your perspectives on that situation. Thank you.
So I think the question that you're raising has as much to do with the question about is Apple committed to ethics in its supply chain versus what choices does Apple have in its supply chain at all? To me, if we step aside a little bit from the question of ethical behavior, there's a deeper question in what you're raising, which is, when you think about why Apple moved, and there's been this big series of studies that were done in the New York Times, they moved outside for production because they just couldn't find suppliers in the United States that had the capability. It was not just cost, that actually had the capability to produce on scale the kinds of things that were needed to be produced in the Apple iPhone. So we accuse places like China and everybody else of stealing jobs because they're low wage. But we need to realize that in part why we're losing jobs in the United States is because we don't have an adequate supply of skills, and therefore suppliers who can actually produce on scale with these skills. In some ways, that's what traps Apple, I think, into being in supply chains that they may find morally offensive because it's not clear what the alternative is. There isn't a supplier today in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world. So I think Apple has to keep trying, and I think Foxconn keeps responding. But it raises another question, which is, should we be in this country much more concerned about the loss of skills that is occurring in the American workforce, that is forcing some of our best manufacturers to seek suppliers elsewhere because they can't find alternative suppliers whom you could trust to have better ethical values in terms of how they manage their workforce here in the United States?
I can't give that kind of an answer. I love my iPhone 4S. It's in my pocket right now, turned off. I actually started doing a little consulting for Apple back in 1981, and I admire the products that have been developed, and I find Steve Jobs to be a terrible example of anything that has to do with moral behavior. I find him to be an abusive human. I'm not very religious. I am a lapsed Presbyterian. But I find his views of philanthropy, his views of, I completely agree, obviously, Nitin, relative to the fact that we don't have the skills that we need. But Steve's notion that he owes the United States nothing makes me ill. Steve Jobs could not have done what Steve Jobs did in very many places on earth other than the United States, if any place else. But if we love Jim Burke, then we can't love Steve Jobs. And I know him. I know very good friends of his. He was not a nice human being. He had a moral compass that was all, boy, do I wish I could use some of the language I did in the Navy, but that was all messed up. And I love his products. I love my iPhone 4S. I'm not going to return it, as some people would have said, but if there was a value set from the top, and he was part of it, then I don't want any part of it. I am no fan of Apple Computer, though I love their products. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be so blunt.
Last week at the UN, Richard Falk, who's the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, the occupied territories, testified and called for a boycott of companies that do business with Israel that helps the occupation. He mentioned specifically companies like Caterpillar, Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and many others. There's not only a business boycott, similar to what was on South Africa of Israel, but there's also an academic boycott of Israel, which your Immersion in Israel group last January chose to flout. But business ethics has to also include human rights, doesn't it? And BDS programs, boycott, divestment, and sanctions are an appropriate tool for responding to businesses' unethical and immoral behavior in cases like South Africa and Israel, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure what the question was. Do you?
Neither do I.
Well, you have to take into account, which you haven't tonight, business ethics as it relates to human rights.
Is there
and the activities that businesses are doing with governments or with other companies that contribute to a violation of human rights, such as in the occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories.
I think he's asking about is ethics related to political issues as well as...
So I think that, there's no doubt that for a lot of people, ethics get related to politics as well. But there's no shortage of, the person who asked the question about Apple raises an interesting question about, how do we think about Apple? And should we, as a result, all of us ban the buying of Apple products? And should we ask my good friend to take his Apple iPhone out and so that we can all burn it in a little pyre outside? I mean those are, so I feel like, yes, you're right. These are, the important thing for us to always do is to have the ability, as you are doing right now, to raise important questions and to have those questions be debated. But when it comes to questions that are of a political nature, I've always found that there's rarely one side to a dialogue like that. And it's not my place to adjudicate. So, but should we care? Of course we should care about businesses and how they engage in human rights. But we should ask that question at home as much as we ask that question in any other country. Can we say that we have businesses in this country that haven't in some ways infringed upon the human rights of people in this country? Certainly during the financial crisis, lots of people asked that question of our own company, of our own businesses. So rather than make this into a political thing that earmarks a particular country or a particular anything, I think we should ask that question in general of any business. That we should admire companies who on average are doing things that are consistent with creating value for society and protecting human rights. And we should always be questioning companies, wherever they might be doing business, who don't seem to do that. So that's how I would respond to it.
I don't know whether I would go further or not. I know that I couldn't get there in a short period of time. I agree with you in theory. And I don't know legally what responsibilities of chief executive officers are. But there's some limit, there's some point at which I become troubled. And I'm not sure what that point is. You take the case of South Africa. Leon Sullivan penned the Sullivan Principles. You could argue that they didn't go far enough, and eventually, obviously, they didn't. It was a useful step, and many signed up for it. I don't know. I can't find it. I can't. When I can't find it within me to say that there aren't, well, the classic cases which we can't re-talk today. IBM and Ford arguably stayed in Nazi Germany far longer than they should have stayed. I don't know how I would resolve that. In retrospect, obvious. In prospect, I don't know.
But there's so many issues like this, Tom, that you have to say, in a democratic system, how do you make decisions about these matters? Cigarette companies. There's half the people on the planet that I know who say that they're causing human rights violations.
Yeah.
To themselves and to other people in the public. And there's other people who say no. In a country in which people have free choice, as long as there's a warning label that says that this is injurious to your health and that of others, you should be allowed to consume it. Like, as dean, do I adjudicate whether we should have anybody in my...
No, I'm not arguing the Wolfowitz case. I'm completely on your side.
The Israel case.
I am, and I'm arguing. I'm troubled by a clear answer to the question because I have no idea what my view is.
Let's take.
No, I mean
Go ahead.
Sorry.
In a lot of cases, it's not a question of right and wrong. It's a question of right in one culture and right in another culture. And you've got to deal with the issue that way. But I have two simpler and quicker questions. One is, are corporations that have adopted and integrated corporate social responsibility or the triple bottom line empirically doing better than companies who are kind of coasting along? And then the second question is, do you see any change in the investment community, venture capital, private equity, institutional investors, in their view of corporate ethics?
So I had a colleague of mine, Joshua Margolis at Harvard Business School, who did a meta-analysis of probably all studies that have been done that say, is there a positive link between corporate social responsibility and corporate profitability? And he found no link, right? But the good news is that he found no negative link either. So then the question that I have is that, if you're no worse off, then why not be better? So I have a very simple view on this, that if you can choose between two things in life, which one in general makes you feel better about being both moral and profitable, and the other one that makes you feel profitable but you're not moral, why not be both moral and profitable? Because at least we know that being moral and profitable doesn't make you any worse off. So that's a good enough reason for me, as opposed to having to argue. Because I actually think we get ourselves into trouble when we say that the only reason why a company should be socially responsible is because in the end it will make it more profitable. Why shouldn't being socially responsible be a good unto itself, as long as it causes no real harm to anything else, right? So that's what his study concluded. As for investors, there's a lot of investors actually who are beginning to see if there's an edge to be found in socially responsible investing. There's a company called Generation Capital, which is based out of the UK, which has that as its exclusive investment strategy. So you're beginning to actually see now investment managers who are trying to see if they can extract an edge out of what you might think of as socially responsible, companies that are socially responsible, who they think may therefore also be economically profitable over time, or at least no worse, in which case they might be able to gather more capital because their LPs are more likely to be willing to invest in them.
Great, thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for doing this. This is an important discussion. Hopefully it's not a unique discussion. The last Fort Hall Forum, Yaron Brook was representing the ideas of Ayn Rand. And after listening to him a little bit, I didn't get a chance to comment, but this idea that you should do things only if it's in your own self-interest seems to be a basic sociopathic view. And also there's a recent book written, Why Nations Fail. I'm sure you know one of the authors. And basically, in the 460 well-written pages, that's basically what it comes down to, that a culture of sociopathy in these countries just goes on no matter how they change the government. Now, in the area of business, I believe there was a book written not that long ago by an author who established that a lot of business leaders do have sociopathic, and your description of Steve Jobs seems to be a basic sociopathic personality. You seem to have a daunting task to just be doing these ethics classes and stuff like that. I mean, some of these people are coming out of schools where you almost have to kill yourself to get into the school in the first place.
A question we've got.
And that's the question. What can you really do when you're already dealing with people who have done almost everything in their power to get where they are, to even get into your school, and then they want to be successful? What are they not going to do?
By that token, you would condemn everybody who gets into an elite institution.
I'm not just saying elite institutions, but just
I mean,
people who are willing to do almost anything to succeed.
So that's a pretty. I so fundamentally disagree with you that I can't even sort of know what really to say. I mean, if your view is that anybody who works hard and is willing to be competitive and is willing to strive to be successful is by definition a sociopath. I don't want to live in your world because
I didn't write the book.
I
don't know what percentage she says it is, but I didn't write the book. I didn't read it yet either.
So look, there's sociopaths in every field. There's
I agree
sociopaths
with
in
you.
every field. There's sociopaths all over the place. I mean, thank God we avoid them. They're axe murderers. But let me assure you, there's no reason at all to suspect that in business there's some special reason why sociopaths get attracted to that field.
Let's go ahead. The next question.
Thank you both for being here. I would like to disagree with Mr. Peters' statement on the regards that business ends end in service. It seems to me that the business ends in profit and therefore thereby making service a means to the end. And this seems apparently evident in insurance companies' core values and then their internal processes that deny people coverage to maximize profit. So how could a business ethical standard remedy that conflict of interest in the insurance world?
Well, I'm not sure I can comment on the insurance world, but I think I would refer to the example of Jim Burke and Johnson & Johnson, where in the short term, it's entirely clear that Johnson & Johnson made decisions that went against short-term profitability. I mean, you and I have a fundamental disagreement. I believe that there's no reason to exist as an individual or an organization if service is not your primary goal. And I happen to have a benign view of the world, which is over the medium and especially the long term, that more often than not, an ethos of service will, if not maximize profit, ensure enough profit for continuation of operation. But I want to look at it in a slightly different way. I'm 70, or I will be next week at this time, and you're not. My concern is, can I look in the mirror and not throw up? And to me, that's a guiding principle for business people, congressmen. I think Nitin said it at the beginning. I don't find any difference between business and any other enterprise. When I talk to people in my seminars, I say to them, and I think my numbers are still right, the number of players on the active duty NFL roster, at least a couple of years ago, was 53. And my comment is, I see no difference between a 53-person IS department and the New England Patriots, meaning it is a set of human beings attempting to perform, to do a task, and to do it as well as they can possibly do it. And so there's, and again, I want to go back to my Cabot Corporation. It is, what the hell are you going to remember? What are you going to remember about life? You're not going to remember profit. No CEO ever went to his death and had a tombstone that said he met quarterly earnings expectations 44 quarters in a row. The memory is that I developed this young man, and he left the company in a horror and went off to do something incredible. And you know, at your school, I worked with one of you back in the old days. Well, you must have known Tony Athos.
Yep.
Tony was a professor at the Harvard Business School. He at one point actually made it onto the cover of Time with some other people as an extraordinary educator. And as Tony was leaving, I remember sitting with him in San Francisco. He did a lot of work with us on what became In Search of Excellence, incidentally. I remember sitting with him in San Francisco, and I said, sum it up for me, your Harvard experience. And he summed it up in terms of 3 professors who he had helped develop over a 25-year period of time. I don't know who they were. I'm sure you probably do or could guess. And those 3 people were making significant contributions to the Harvard Business School and indeed society. But he defined an incredibly productive life in terms of 3 people who had gone on to make an extraordinary difference, in part due to his development skills. And my point to the young men in their mid-40s who I was talking to in Zurich a couple of years ago is, baby, you can't start at 68. And if you want to be able to look in that mirror at 68, you better have started long before 48, frankly. But you know, it's a personal view, and I'm quite intempered of people who don't. I mean, I have a great Chicago priest friend who says that I'm too religious for my own good, even though I don't go to church. But I really do believe, I don't, at some level, and you know, we could talk institutional issues forever and ever on this topic, but I believe in higher moral purpose that has virtually nothing to do with God. I don't care whether you're an atheist or whether you're a true believer of the most extraordinary sort, and that's why the hell we're here. You know, last night, and I suspect some of you saw it, there was an HBO show on Ethel Kennedy. And the thing that I remember most about it, and my apologies if I get the wording a little bit wrong, RFK, needless to say, was completely devastated by his brother's assassination to the point that he was dysfunctional for months. But only either 2 days or 2 weeks after the assassination, he wrote his eldest daughter, Kathleen, a short little handwritten letter, and the last sentence said, "Be kind and serve your country." And you know, in the course of that hour, I was moved by very many things. But that letter, in an odd way, and they showed it on the screen, was to me as beautiful a moment as I've seen in a long period of time.
I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to give you the 5-minute warning. I hope that we'll get to all of our questions, and if you're all very pithy, I think Donna will let you have your questions.
Talk fast.
Thank you. In my opinion, ethics seems very objective, and an example I think highlights this is sweatshops. And the economic literature that I've read says that it improves the standards of living of the people living in these countries. And I'm just curious, by trying to follow these ethics, by allowing consumers to determine the most ethical companies, are we sacrificing gains in our standards of living, or can we possibly arrive at the best ethics with not moral philosophers as consumers? So I'm just wondering what your opinion is.
So we teach cases about this all the time. We have a case on the carpet industry and the use of child labor in the carpet industry. And what we have our students wrestle with is exactly the question that you pose, which is this is an industry that has historically been rife with examples of child labor. It has been an industry that has been historically rife with examples of sweatshops or versions thereof. And the economic conditions of the people who work in these places is that they work voluntarily because the alternative to them is an even worse circumstance, right? So the question is, do you therefore think that that's morally acceptable? Because should the baseline be that you're at least better off? Or should the moral standard be, no, it should never be acceptable to exploit anybody? And we have people who get very torn on that, right? And this is what makes, these are the kinds of questions that moral philosophers have wrestled with forever. So you can take a utilitarian perspective and you can argue that this is a good thing. You can take a justice perspective and you can argue that this is a bad thing. I mean, that's the tricky thing about moral choices. It's not, there are many standards on the basis of which you make moral choices. And I doubt that we will easily, when it comes to moral affairs, settle on some universal standards by which we make these choices. But at least having business leaders that we educate, and that's my goal and commitment at Harvard Business School, wrestle with these things so that they know that there are competing choices at claim, and what they settle on, at least they know they settle on because they have weighed these competing ways of making the argument. Makes me feel a little bit better about the people that we educate, without having the certainty that I wish we had about a universal moral standard that everybody could aspire to. Because on that one question, there isn't one. There literally are competing claims that people have.
I just want to add one thing because I want to do my applause line again for Nitin. 40 years later, I'm still furious. I love my business school. I adore Stanford University. And I am still appalled 40 years later that it was not a basis for discussion. And I'm not talking about I'm talking about anywhere. And I just think that what you are attempting to do is so extraordinary that I'm delighted to be allowed in the same room with you.
Wow.
And that, I mean, as you said, there are no right answers, but for God's sakes, at least acknowledge that it's an issue on the table.
We have to get at least another woman's question in here.
Okay.
Okay.
I have served on a public company board with some highly ethical men, most of whom you would know. I was the only woman on the board. And one of the things that it sort of struck me is that ethics can be, dying by 1,000 cuts, death by 1,000 cuts. There's nothing major. And a lot of it was, because I'm a native Vermonter, I question everything. And it was like, why are you thinking this is such a big deal? So my question is, my first ethics class was when I was a junior at Georgetown. Should ethics, practical ethics, not theoretical ethics, be pushed down not only into the high school level, but into the grade school level so that people who push buttons that give shocks to people can actually be understood by a developing brain? And how do you think the Harvard Business School can impact the education of young people throughout the country?
So I'm glad you asked that question because it's astonishing to me how often the question is asked, can ethics even be taught?
Right.
Most people, when they ask that question, it's a rhetorical question. They actually are saying, no, I don't even believe that ethics can be taught. It's something that you learn on your parents' knees, and by the time you're a teenager, your ethics are already fully formed. As I said, the first thing that I think we need to all realize that moral development is a lifelong process, just like the development of any other capability. That we're all capable of being vulnerable, that ideas about what constitute morality continue to evolve. And having the capacity from the earliest days to engage in a conversation like that so that we can have conversations with ourselves that allow us to entertain our own moral doubts and have ways of thinking about them is an enormously powerful skill, just like reading and writing and arithmetic and everything else. But it isn't a skill that we actually cultivate or train early on because we end up with this much more black and white view that people are either moral or immoral, as opposed to people are permanently confronted with moral doubt and they need to have a vocabulary and a way of thinking about it. So I applaud your sentiment. I deeply believe that the earlier we start this conversation, the more we create capacities for people to have a way of thinking, just like in anything else. The benefit of an education is that it gives you ways of confronting questions that you have in life.
But I'll take late even. I mean, and it gets back to the thing I was saying about Nitin. When the horror of your question and your comment about Georgetown, and I would expect it from Georgetown, is no. I mean, in the best. No. The fact that it
Great
happened
place.
at all is a
Is a virtue.
I love Jesuit institutions. I wish the hell I'd gone to one, but
You wouldn't say hell that much.
it doesn't matter if you're Presbyterian. You were picked before you got here, so you're. But the troublesome thing, and again, I know I'm talking about approximately a millennium ago. I'm obviously in this room indirectly only because from a lower middle class family I had the opportunity to attend both Cornell and Stanford. I have a bachelor's in engineering from Stanford, or a bachelor of science in engineering from Stanford. From Cornell. I have a bachelor of science in engineering. I have a master's in engineering from Cornell. I have a master's in business from Stanford and a PhD in business from Stanford, and I have yet to take my first ethics course in college. Class. And that's appalling. And I've made my point to the engineering school more than the business school.
Nitin will invite you to Harvard.
No, I am now re-engaging myself with the Cornell Engineering School, which goes back to Nitin and his sister initially, because engineers do have a Hippocratic oath. It's called a professional, when you become a professional engineer. And I am understanding of, again, as Nitin said early on, of the pressures that BP field engineers faced. And I'm more than willing to blame the BP culture, which is appropriate, but I do not forgive any engineer for not having blown the whistle, despite the fact that maybe he couldn't have raised the tuition to send his kids to private school. And I'm working on that at Cornell, a little teeny bit. But it belongs in my bloody engineering school, let alone my business school. And that obviously there aren't any answers, but for God's sakes, you can at least talk about it on a regular basis. And you damn well ought to do it as much in a structural engineering course at Cornell University as you do in a Jesuit school in Washington, D.C.
I'm sorry, we do have to end. The people who have questions, I'm sure the folks up here wouldn't mind if you came up and they could answer while they were still sitting here. In the meantime, how about a big hand for all of our speakers and moderators?